Okay. Hi, Denise, or AVA Plan Committee and Chair Ward. Yes, we'll start with the call to order, and Chris, me with the city will do a roll call vote for everyone to acknowledge who is currently present as part of this meeting.
Okay, so as I read your name, just say here, okay? So Denise Work. Here. Tony Matlock.
Here.
Denise Allen.
Present.
Craig Heaps. Christine Moeller.
Yep.
Ben Mosafari.
Here.
Craig Subig.
Present.
J.R. Algor. Mess up his name. Mike Koyman. Bobby Duncan. And Jillian Kowalczyk.
Here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we were officially called to order, a minute ago, 3:06. So who would like to do a flag salute? Let's just all do it together, okay? I have a flag outside my window that I'm going to look at, so. So ready, begin. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right.
Sure.
Approval of the minutes. Has everyone read the minutes, and would someone like to make a motion to approve the minutes in the last meeting?
I've read the minutes. This is Tony, and I'd like to make a motion to approve them.
Okay. Can I have a second? Christine, you were present. Can you second the minutes?
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay.
Yeah, we should probably do, given the teleconference, it may be prudent to do a roll call vote just so that we can make sure the record is current on that.
So I'll read your names and just say aye, okay? So Denise Work.
Aye.
Tony Matlock.
Aye.
Denise Allen.
Aye.
Christine Moeller.
Aye.
Ben Mosafari.
Aye.
Craig Subig.
Aye.
And did Craig Heaps ever come back in? No? Okay. All right.
Jillian.
And Jillian, sorry.
Aye.
Okay. Thank you. 6, 7.
Okay. Are there any public comments to read into the minute, Ben?
No, there were no public comments received. However, I did want to inform the committee that Mike Koyman has resigned from the committee, and so we will be going back to City Council to reappoint another landowner for the AVAPC.
Okay. All right. Very good. So last meeting we covered the RENA numbers and assessments, and today it looks like we're going to hear from the Wine Alliance. I assume that's you, Craig?
Yes.
All right. Floor is yours.
So just quickly, the Yucaipa Valley Wine Alliance has provided a presentation and sent it to us, and so we will be broadcasting it for everyone to review. Craig, or if Devin is also present, just let us know when to flip slides, and we will be happy to do so. And then there will be a Q&A at the end, so all the members feel free. We can participate, and we'll kind of work through, I think, how the questions go, just so that everyone has a chance to ask questions, especially since we're kind of in the teleconference format, so no one can see if someone's hand is raised, as it were. So try to work through that, but excited for this presentation.
Thanks, Ben. So given the amount of relevant information I think that needs to be presented, I guess this essentially would constitute the first of a two-part series geared to educate
Is now joining.
on the issues and topics necessary in developing the Yucaipa Valley into a viable wine region. Next slide, please.
Many of you know Craig already from his time on the board, but I'll just introduce myself. My name's Devin Cohen. With Craig, we both wrote the Yucaipa Valley AVA petition over the course of the last year and a half. And I'm going to be here to kind of supplement the information that Craig presents, and he'll kind of invoke me at certain times to talk about things. But yeah, just wanted to introduce myself and say, happy to be here and happy to present this info. So we can go to the next slide, Craig.
Okay, so today, essentially, this is a sort of a focus reset. We have been talking about primarily the housing goals, and for the very first time, we're going to have the opportunity to focus on, really what I believe this board was assembled to do, and that is to create and implement a wine region in the Yucaipa Valley. This is really a revolution in thinking. And the reason I say that is because this is a very long-term concept. And this concept could last, a century, 2 centuries. So we really have to carefully consider how we approach developing this region, because this is something that's going to be handed down from one generation to the next. And what that means to us is that we really have to be responsible in making the correct decisions and really making sure that our goals and objectives are very clear and are of complete benefit to everyone moving down the road. Next slide, please, Greg. Okay. So those of us that have worked in the trenches thus far may never see or experience the real fruits of our labor, since this is such a long-term plan. But, our legacy is important here, and the benefit of, future generations is going to be one that's permanent. Once we establish an infrastructure in this industry, in the wine industry, it is of a permanent nature. You don't plant grapes, which are very, very labor intensive, and go rip them out. So once we embark on this journey, it's one that's very permanent. So I think it's really important that we, again, carefully consider everything that we do with respect to building this industry. Next slide, Greg. Okay, AVA petition process. Let me just explain exactly what an American viticultural area is. It is a designation that is received from the Tobacco Tax Trade Bureau, and it designates an area in what we call an appellation.
Is now exiting.
So it's extremely important that we address the significance of this. Now, there's less than 250 of these AVAs in the United States. So receiving that designation is extremely important. And in a couple minutes, I'll talk about why that's so important. But let's just get to exactly where we are with this petition process. Greg, if you don't mind, next slide. Thank you. So the initial petition was submitted back in November 2018, and it was a lot of work. 3 people responsible for crafting most of that document, and we finally got it submitted November 2018, and it was returned on a couple of different occasions with the request for some revisions, which we completed. And finally, that petition was accepted as perfected in June of 2019. Where we stand right now with it is there are a few items that need to be completed with respect to that petition. And it certainly procedurally is not something that is pressing at the moment, given the time that these application processes take. We are in constant communication with our representative, and we have a little ways to go, but as we move forward, those items will be completed, and once completed, it will go to rulemaking, which means this is a petition that's going to be published in the Federal Register. And once accepted and approved by the Tobacco Tax Trade Bureau, wineries in the Yucaipa Valley will be able to submit their COLAs, or what we call label submission, which would give us the ability to have Yucaipa Valley on our wine bottles. That is a requirement. And what that means for legal purposes is that if a bottle of wine says Yucaipa Valley, 85% of the grapes that went into making that bottle of wine come from the Yucaipa Valley. The other 15% can come from another AVA somewhere or a non-AVA.
Also, the status that we're presenting to you today is in effect an estimation based upon our best estimates, and it's always hard to tell how long it's going to take for any federal approval process to really run its course. However, we are in constant contact with our TTB rep, and just to let everyone on the board know, as long as we put in the correct work and we do the right things, 100% of AVA petitions that are submitted to the TTB do eventually pass muster and are published in the Federal Register. Some might take longer than others if there are supplementary boundary revisions, which Craig is going to be talking about, the historic valley boundaries that we needed to abide by in this process. But the Yucaipa Valley AVA petition will be passed and it will be published in the Federal Register anytime within the next 2 to 3 years. And that's if we are able to continue doing the job that we've done so far. So.
Thanks, Devin. Next slide, Greg, please. Okay, thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about the significance of an AVA designation. And we can go on to the next slide, Greg. So there's a couple of factors here. We just sort of listed them out for you. You can read them at your leisure. Economic viability, consumer trust, and producer benefits. So I guess a couple of items are especially important here. With an AVA designation, you sort of get a guarantee of origin. And that's really important once an AVA begins to create its identity of what they're producing, what type of wines come out of that region, what type of grapes are grown there. And it gives the consumer a way of making a real identification to that particular region. So, as we know, in California, everyone has heard of Napa, Sonoma, and over a period of time, not only do those regions command a lot of respect in the industry, but consumers are able to turn to those regions with a lot of trust and confidence and purchase those wines. The tourism destination is another really important one, I believe. The largest industry we have in the state of California is the dairy industry, followed by the wine industry. And what sets the wine industry apart is that the wine industry is #1 in tourism. So where wine goes, people go, usually with some extra disposable income, let's say. And there certainly is a benefit to a number of different type of businesses, including support industries such as restaurants and hotels and things of that particular nature. So at a later time, we'll discuss the concept of that destination, which has always been part of the Alliance's vision in creating an industry and developing businesses within our city. Next slide, Greg, please. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the boundaries of the AVA and available land for growing. And this is a question that I am asked quite a bit. When the AVA was written, we had to follow some pretty strict guidelines. And as you can see, on the slide, the boundaries for the Yucaipa Valley AVA is essentially Yucaipa, Calimesa, Oak Glen, and some surrounding county areas. And we needed to reference historically the Yucaipa Valley to all of these places. So if you didn't have a reference to the Yucaipa Valley, then we could not include that within its boundary. So this took a lot of historical research going back to even before the turn of the century.
Totally. And just so everyone knows too, probably the hardest, I would say one of the hardest parts of the AVA petition for Craig and I to write was the narrative justification for the boundaries. We needed to actually list out a narrative, a worded narrative justifying the drawn boundaries that we had drawn for the AVA petition, and historically link them to why we drew the boundaries like that based upon the origins and references for the Yucaipa Valley. It was a very difficult task, and we finally were able to perfect the petition and get that map right on the 4th revision. So it took a really long time, and that was a really difficult part of getting this right. But what we used as our baseline was that the Yucaipa Valley Historical Society defines the Yucaipa Valley as everything we have written on this slide: City of Yucaipa, Calimesa, Oak Glen, and some surrounding area. That was our baseline, and we drew the AVA boundaries to match the baseline provided to us by the Historical Society.
Okay, next slide, Greg. And so one other thing I'd like to add to that is just because, those boundaries were drawn, people have approached the Alliance and, sort of complained that, well, they weren't included in the AVA. And there's nothing to stop someone from writing another AVA and creating certain boundaries. So we might see that in the near future. We'll just have to see how that goes. Currently, though, the Yucaipa Valley encompasses just a little over 30,000 acres. And we've kind of figured that out of that 30,000, 5,000 to 7,000 would be considered prime agricultural lands. And the position of the Yucaipa Valley Wine Alliance is, of course, to preserve the most prime and pristine agricultural lands for vinification. Next slide, please. Okay, what makes the Yucaipa Valley a world-class wine growing region? Roughly in 2012, once my winery began to gain international recognition, I started receiving a number of different phone calls from folks up in places like Napa and Sonoma who told me that we had been looking at the Yucaipa Valley for about 15 years, but there was no interest in wine there. There were no wineries. There was no one growing grapes. They explained to me that what we have in the Yucaipa Valley was an ideal growing region. Not good, but ideal. And thereafter, I began to do my own research, and about a year later determined that this indeed was a very, very special area. And we're going to talk about why it's so special here in a minute. But what I want to convey to all of you is we really do have a gift here. This region is absolutely amazing. And the more we research it, the more study we do on it, the more we learn about how special it is. And it is a gift. And it's something that we really cannot squander. So we will have, once passed, the highest elevation AVA here in California. And there's a lot of different benefits to not only the elevation, but a couple of the other concepts we're going to talk about in a little bit. The higher the elevation, obviously, the increased sun exposure the fruit receives, which is extremely important for tannin production and sugar production. We do have winter weather, snow, which is very good for vines. A lot of vines are now cloned, so they are temperature resistant, disease resistant in a number of different ways. Winter frost and snow preserves not only hydrate reserves, but also insects. Makes it very difficult when snow is on vines for insects to infiltrate the vine and create chaos within the vine. Cooler nights provide natural acidity to grapes, which is really important, and create really nice balance in the fruit.
And to add to what Craig is saying about this being a very rare growing region, the thing that is most unique about the Yucaipa Valley, and this is why we put it first, is the elevation.
Is now joining.
The thing that's most unique about the Yucaipa Valley is absolutely its elevation. We're going to be talking about alluvial fanning and diurnal shifts, aka temperature swings, over the next couple slides. But having high elevation for a grape growing region, and Craig mentioned tannin production, when grapes are exposed to this amount of sunlight, it actually helps them thicken their skins, and they do that as a defense mechanism to protect the seeds in the grapes from the sun. And every world-class wine region around the world, every winemaker and every viticulturalist is looking for ways to get their tannin in their skin, to get the tannin production up, because it creates more complex wines, it creates more age-worthy wines. And this is why we believe, based upon the elevation alone, not even including the temperature swings and not even including other soil types in the Yucaipa Valley, we can make wines that rival some of the best in California.
Next slide, Greg, please. So diurnal variation, very important concept, and that's actually divided into two areas. So we have diurnal temperature variation and diurnal temperature shifts. So diurnal temperature variation is essentially the variation in temperature that occurs from the highest to the lowest during the day and has a significant impact on wine grape ripening progress, especially with reference to sugar accumulation. Diurnal shifts are one of the greatest, I guess, natural phenomenon with respect to grape growing. So critical is the balance between the sugars, which equate to alcohol essentially in the end. The higher the sugar, obviously the higher alcohol in a wine, and acidity, which translates through fermentation to wine that adds freshness and balance. So the Yucaipa Valley enjoys an ideal diurnal temperature shift of, well, exactly 29.1 degrees Fahrenheit, which is ideal. And that is a real motivating factor as to why vinifying our land in this region is so important. Many, many, many regions cannot claim that. So we were given that, and we need to utilize that. So next slide, Greg, please. So we did mention alluvial fanning, which creates a diversified soil set, everything from sandy loam to clay, and recently we just learned through a geologist of the amount of decomposed granite in our soil, which is pretty amazing, since we can say with certainty that with materials like granite and slate, it provides a lot of benefit when it comes to irrigation in the land, and it avoids having water around the roots of a vine and just provides really, really good drainage. So making healthier vines and increasing the quality of our fruit. Next slide, please. So as we can see, there's a lot of potential here in the Yucaipa Valley, given the combination of elevation, temperature shifts, alluvial fanning. And I think, you know, as we've all heard the expression, great wines can only come from great grapes. I can tell you that as a winemaker, balance is key and is critical in the winemaking process. And that balance actually begins in the vineyard. So you have titratable acidity, you have alcohol, phenolic structure, tannin, all that requires balance. And if the grapes don't come out of the vineyard balanced, then the winemaker has to work extra hard trying to balance these things out. And for people that take a very natural approach to this art of winemaking, the less you have to tweak things, the less you have to add tartaric acid or calcium, potassium carbonate to wines to adjust things. I think in the long run, the better off we are. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a big question that the Alliance hears a lot at different meetings, and everyone that wants to vinify land says, what should we plant? Back 2011, 2012, when I planted out some land, the only guidance I had was some Cabernet Sauvignon and some Chardonnay that was planted on the east end of Yucaipa. Today, we have done quite a bit of experimentation and asked a number of our members to plant out different cultivars. And we want to see what works and what doesn't work. Now, there's a couple of different approaches we can take to that. One would be a shotgun approach. We'll just plant a bunch of different things and produce wine from them. The other approach, which I think is really important, and I think it's really important because this is a very, very competitive industry, that we need to find an identity for the Yucaipa Valley. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what grape or grapes would best suit the valley in order to establish an identity. And so where we are at this point is we're looking at a few different varietals. Next slide, Greg, please. There we go. Thank you. Just make it a little bit easier. So Malbec being one is a high elevation grape. Its home was originally Bordeaux, France, but it's really found its home in Argentina, specifically the Mendoza region, where grapes are growing at a higher elevation. They're in the foothills of the Andes. And we want to utilize our elevation here to hopefully cultivate this grape to its fullest potential. And what that would mean is Malbec does not really have a home here in the United States. So conceivably, if this grape works out and we produce world-class Malbec, people could travel from all over the globe to taste Yucaipa Valley Malbec. It's not the only grape that's going to work. There obviously are others as well. The question becomes how familiar they are to the consumer. So we listed a few: Lagrange, Sagrantino, Aglianico. These are Italian grapes. Some of them grow in various places in Italy, some up in the Northeast, some in the South. So we will have to see as time goes on which grape is best suited for this region. But at least the Alliance believes that taking the approach of finding an identity grape for this region to really put this region on the map is pretty important. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, land requirements for a wine industry. Next slide, thanks. So, I think what's key here when we ask ourselves, as far as thresholds go for creating a wine industry, I think we have to bear in mind constantly the concept of growth. And I think as the industry grows in the Yucaipa Valley, so does the need for land. And really preserving as much of our prime growing lands to vinify and to have the accessibility to that fruit is extremely important. For a person who's been in this business for a little while, I know how difficult it is to source fruit from different regions. And if your choice is not to source your fruit from Temecula, which there are two AVAs there, South Coast and Temecula Valley, if you choose not to do that, you're in for a lot of work. So it's really important, I think, to focus our attention to preserving some of these lands that we have on the North Bench and on the East End for as much vinification as possible.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that we kind of felt it necessary to reframe the question is that the question of what would the land requirements be for a wine industry seemed very cut and dry to us, as if there was a specific threshold that we could or could not cross. Yeah, we wanted to kind of reframe the methodology of building a wine industry when we're looking at creating a 100-year sustainable industry where land requirements for grapes will grow as an industry grows. We want to focus on maintaining as many of these prime agricultural lands as possible. And so that's why, and Greg, if you can go to the next slide, I'll talk about the Ribbon Ridge. And this is a case study that we wanted to bring up to everyone. The Ribbon Ridge AVA is located in Oregon's Willamette Valley. It's become internationally renowned for the quality of its Pinot Noir and its Chardonnay. And the Ribbon Ridge is one of the smallest AVAs in the entire country. The whole AVA has under 600 acres of land. And in those 600 acres, 30 wineries exist, and they create a multi-million-dollar infrastructure and destination for people to visit. Now, one thing we don't want to do is put anyone under the pretenses that, like, oh, these people did it with 600 acres of land, that's all we'll need. The reason that the AVA of Ribbon Ridge was successful is they effectively dedicated the entire 600 acres to viticulture, and they created a strong trade organization to promote their grapes internationally. So this is an example of how, on one end, you have the Ribbon Ridge. You can be successful with, an area of that size. However, there needs to be a focus on viticulture. There needs to be a focus on wineries and generating a pathway for wineries to start. And they are more successful than AVAs with 40,000 acres because they have had a focus on maintaining all of those lands long term. So, Greg, we can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Okay, estate wineries versus non-estate wineries. Yeah, we can go to the next slide, Greg. And so I just want to distinguish between these two, which I think is really important. Initially, the vision for creating a wine industry here was creating boutique and micro boutique wineries in the Yucaipa Valley. And they do have definitions. A micro boutique winery is a 1,500 case production winery or less. And then we move up to a boutique. And there's different guidelines for these wineries. But really the sweet spot is maybe no more than 5,000 cases per year production. And the differences become very important when you look at the differences between estate and non-estate wineries. So estate wineries basically are from vine to wine. They control the entire life cycle of the product, from growing to bottling and direct-to-consumer sales. And 100% of the grapes that go into those estate-made wines come from that estate. There's a few examples there on your slide. And then you have the non-estate wineries. The French like to call them négociants. basically sourcing your fruit from other areas and growers in order to make your own wine. So as I said, the possibility does exist. Let's say if you decided to go to Temecula for fruit, you could do that, which would sort of defeat the purpose of what we're trying to achieve here in the Yucaipa Valley, and that is to use Yucaipa Valley fruit in our wines. And obviously, the more vinified land that we have, the easier it is for whether it's an estate existing in that AVA or a non-estate winery sourcing fruit from the Yucaipa Valley. The work is made so much easier in wine production. So, next slide, Greg, please. Okay, so grape growers, sometimes we don't think of them as such, but they are farmers and certainly an integral part of the whole viticulture process. And oftentimes the question arises with people planting out, especially now, larger parcels being planted out, 5 acres, 6 acres, etc., on what to do with the grapes. Not everyone wants to be a winemaker. So people that are solely focused on growing grapes ask a very legitimate question. What do I do with these grapes? And so these growers obviously can look to the local wineries to sell to. They can also provide fruit to wineries that are not within wineries that are not located in the Yucaipa Valley designation. So it's really important to not just think in terms of a one-dimensional type of thinking in that, well, if I'm going to grow grapes, I have to make wine. That's not necessarily the case. And there are some really prominent growers in other counties that essentially have acres and acres and acres of grapes. And we have taken the time out to discuss with them growing techniques and land uses, etc., and trying to incorporate that into what we're doing here in the Yucaipa Valley. Next slide, please. And so this is really a team effort between all types of wineries, growers, and the idea is to really create a cohesive marketplace for this industry. It's really, really important not to establish a minimum threshold for acreage in order to constitute a winery here. Again, as I think I've already mentioned, that as this industry grows over time, so will the land requirements grow. And the need will be greater as we develop and grow for grapes. So, next slide. Okay. Minimum parcel size for a winery.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So this is another question that we've been getting a lot about what should we use as the baseline minimum acreage for a direct-to-consumer winery. And over the last 4 slides, we discussed the difference between an estate winery, between a grower, between a non-estate winery. And we hope that adds a little bit of nuance to everybody's perspective because not all wineries are the same. And the example that we put up on this slide is that, a 5-acre estate winery who outgrows the demand that they can supply reasonably with their own fruit, they can be just as successful as a 25-acre estate winery, because they, if they have a marketplace for grapes, can go and shop with other growers and with other wineries who have had a good vintage or who have had a good crop. So that 5-acre parcel can actually be producing more gross revenue than a 25-acre estate winery if it has the demand and it has good winemaking techniques. So we definitely, in this case, we want to reframe this question to say that we don't want to put an undue burden on emerging wineries within this region by saying that they need to maintain an acreage that's not realistic, because we want to give people the opportunity to function as a normal winery in the wine region. And I'm sure that, questions will arise on this slide. And, you guys have any questions, you can always ask them during the Q&A. But in this section, we just really want to reiterate, having a minimum size for a winery or a parcel is not the best idea, because it prohibits a lot of different wineries from popping up. And Greg, if you go to the next slide, we kind of put together, because we didn't want to leave everybody hanging here, and we said to ourselves, if there is going to be some type of minimum parcel requirement, we definitely would recommend, in our professional opinion, that it's not less than 5 acres. Or sorry, that it's not more. Apologies, it's not more than 5 acres, stating that a winery needs to be more than 5 acres in order to have it be considered a winery, because that would absolutely limit the amount of wineries that we could have in this region. And the more of an industry that we provide, the more jobs that come here, the more cross collaboration we have between vintners, viticulturalists, and between landowners. That's something we want to encourage, and setting a threshold too high, anything above 5 acres would really seem pretty self-defeating when it comes to minimum acreage size for a winery. So yeah, great, we can go to the next slide. So that's going to conclude our first presentation on kind of building a long-term wine industry in the Yucaipa Valley. We laid out a roadmap for the next presentation by the Yucaipa Valley Wine Alliance, which addresses equally important topics, especially one that a lot of the board has been asking about, and that's mixing agriculture and residential. And we're going to bring some expert opinions to the table and do a specific review of agricultural and residential land and its potential for being mixed. And we're also going to discuss in that section the importance of a destination. Also, we want to bring up the very parameters of the grant that funds the AVA PC and do a full examination of the SALC grant directive. SALC stands for Sustainable Agriculture and Lands Conservation Grant, which funds what we're doing. And we want to ensure that the vision that we are promoting here is consistent with the vision of the SALT grant. Then we are going to discuss, we're going to be examining the economics of a wine industry, potential for job growth, potential for support industry growth, and planning the industry infrastructure. That's where we will address traffic concerns, as well as other, and we're going to be addressing traffic concerns and other issues during that section. And then at the very end, we're going to lay out the metrics for success, which are the metrics that we would use for creating a 100-year wine industry in the Yucaipa Valley.
Okay. The other thing that I'd like to make a motion to the board for would be the opportunity here to do a study session and bring in some professionals from the industry that have even more experience than we do, and can explain what to expect and anticipate, as these, people have actually written AVAs and been at the beginning of the development of a wine industry and seen it through. So I think their advice, opinion, would be very valuable to the board in making decisions in the future.
Okay, this is Denise. I don't have a problem with having a study session. I don't know if it might be a little premature to have a motion to do that at this point. I want to know what Ben and Sheila think about that as far as when it will fit into our schedule. I think it's a great idea, though. I would love to have it. Does anyone have questions?
Yeah, Greg, we can go to the next slide. We're doing the, if anyone has any questions, we're happy to try and address anyone's questions or concerns.
This is Bobby Duncan. I have a question. Can you hear me?
We can hear Bobby, yep.
So how many acres are planted right now? I mean, we're talking about the Yucaipa Wine Alliance. We're talking about some folks that are enthusiastic about what we're talking about. How many acres of grapes are planted currently in our area, in the area of the North Bench and or the east part of the city?
Well, within the boundaries, we have about 40 acres identified. And what we have noticed over the past, I would say 9 months, is that the requests of people vinifying, they are vinifying larger parcel. So in the early days, it was maybe a half an acre, 3/4. Now we're seeing 6 acres at a time being vinified. So larger parcels. But currently we're at about 40 acres vinified within the boundary.
Okay, thank you. That's what I needed to find out. Thanks.
Sure.
Anyone else?
So this has been with the city. I wanted to touch base back on the study session and kind of offer that to the AVAPC. The second presentation wasn't necessarily on the original tentative kind of schedule of vision, but certainly if the community at large would like to see kind of the deeper dive, the Yucaipa Valley Wine Alliance and working with Sheila and I can kind of strategize setting that up either for the next meeting and going forward. But it wasn't necessarily part of the next schedule, but may be very helpful to kind of give that professional insider perspectives as we kind of move on to the visioning side and then setting that table as well. So.
I have a question. I'd like to make a comment. Denise?
Go ahead, Christine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I thought the information was great. I thought, your presentation was wonderful and the processes and your thoughts. So it really gave me a great insight into all the work that you've put into it and the money. But I think on the next, we did have it scheduled and, we talked about a tight timeline and trying to get this accomplished within 24 months. And, you just mentioned another second part of this as well as a study session. But I think that, we have a pretty broad understanding of what it takes and what your, the process was and your opinion about the acreage and things like that. But I noticed in your slides, you did traffic studies and stuff like that. And I think that that's up to the consultants to do those type of works and to make their recommendations. And if we feel we need more background into that process and, going forward, then maybe we can circle around. But in the interest of going forward, I think we just need to keep marching forward. That's my suggestion.
So if you don't mind, Christine, I'd be happy to kind of respond on some of those concerns. In this case, I think it's much more important for them to go fast. And in this next presentation, I mean, the first presentation that we just gave right now was a baseline for the understanding of creating a successful wine industry. I know you mentioned traffic. We've had funded studies by the University of Redland's Capstone program that have examined the impact that a wine industry would create on our traffic infrastructure.
Excuse me for a second. I just, I'm not trying to dispute your information. I just think that, I'm just not sure that, we're doing an overlay for the city. We're trying to make recommendations to city council. I'm not sure that we have to digest, what it takes to be that region. I think our focus is to make suggestions to city council and not really become the experts that you are. I mean, that's what you do, and you're making great suggestions here. I'm not sure if we need that type of depth, but that's just my take on it. I just want to march forward.
Yeah, and Christine, again, I'd really like to finish the point that I was making. We are not trying to make everyone experts on a topic that we are experts on. We need city council and we need this board to be armed with the most relevant information possible to make the most informed decisions that impact the future of this city. And this is gonna impact the city of Yucaipa for generations to come. So, it was Ben and Sheila that sent us over a list of items that they would like us to cover, including how to mix agriculture and residential, how traffic would be impacted in the Yucaipa Valley. And as you saw, we did our best to condense our first presentation into about a 40-minute session, but it would be impossible for city council and this board to make informed decisions if we did not have at least another presentation to talk about the things that this board needs to make good decisions. So it's really imperative that this information gets digested by this board and is presented to city council, because if it is not, then we will be making decisions based upon information that's not been fully provided. And that's something that nobody wants.
Okay, I am interested in hearing the rest of the presentation. I would like to know how the rest of the committee feels about that, but I appreciate the information, and I don't think this is something that we have to, even though we've set up a timeline, I don't want to rush through something and make, decisions that we'll be sorry for later. So I think it's important that we get all the information from all of the sources that we can. What is the rest of the, does anyone disagree with that other than Christine or, and Dan, I need to know what your opinion is on this as well.
Well, this is Tony here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think that, we owe the city to provide the best information from what we can. So this is a fact gathering sessions here through this year. So the more we're knowledgeable of at least perspectives and things, I think it would help us, move maybe faster later on than having to go back and revisit things. I think the more we can get information into us right now. So I would be for having the next presentation go through, maybe even, having them provide the information in advance so we can maybe, kind of have some more questions that we can go with at that point in time. Because I know as with everybody, I think of really good things to ask, 5 minutes after we hang up. So I'd like to, have an opportunity to maybe have a chance to review it. But, this is all information that's been worked through. I think if we digest it, it gives us an opportunity to help make better recommendations for the city.
I agree with you, Tony. The other thing is that it would be great. This is a nice presentation. It would be nice to have it ahead of time so that we can have our questions, ready. And so I wonder if
the Alliance would be more than happy to provide it in advance. The thing I want to emphasize is, these decisions that the board makes and that council ultimately will make, we really can't compromise what we're doing here. It just really does have so much importance and significance moving forward. I've never felt that time is of the essence with this process or anything with respect to the industry. So, making the right decision is very, very important, and we need to always bear that in mind.
And we're happy to coordinate with Ben and Sheila and get everyone on the board a copy of the next presentation at least a week in advance so they can come prepared with questions as well.
That would be super helpful if you could work with Ben and Sheila on all of this. Your plan may be what you may think is compromising it, maybe some things that the city council or that some others have a disagreement with you on. I understand that we need to, the parts that we really need to you for is this process, this great growing and acreage and, all of these things that pertain to the area. But I mean, when you say that we can't have it, you don't want it compromised. I don't think you expect to be able to just say cookie cutter, this is what we're doing, do you? Devin, is that something that you're thinking that we need to, that you guys we just adopt this whole plan that you have? Is that what you want?
Well, what I think is that in this case, and I'm gonna echo Christine here, we don't need to make everyone into experts, but we need to give everyone a very broad understanding of the inner workings of a wine industry. Like, I'm not sure how many people, for an example, before this session could kind of understand the nuance between growers, estate wineries, non-estate wineries, and how they work to build a marketplace for grapes within a region, and that helps to create economic viability. Those small nuances are the things that help us make determinations about land use, about where to put housing that is part of the SALT grant. And so everybody, I think, on the board needs to have the full understanding of wine industry creation. And that's why, again, we're happy to provide we definitely, I would say, need at least one more presentation to provide all the baseline relevant information. But we have industry experts on standby that we would like to introduce everyone on the board to. We've already had people come to us and volunteer to come speak to you guys. And these are people who have written AVAs and championed wine industries. These are big players in the Temecula Valley wine industry, in the Santa Barbara wine industry, that want to get involved and want to make sure that since we do have this unique opportunity, we pursue it correctly. So effectively, our goal is really to provide the information that this board needs to make informed decisions. And we want to do everything possible to make sure that that happens.
This is Craig Heaps. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Craig.
Yep.
Okay, good. I just want to, maybe this is for Sheila, and I first of all, thanks for the presentation, guys, and I agree with Christine. We need to really be on task and make sure we know. What I'm really wondering about is the economics of this. At what point do we get to the economics of this so we understand not just that we can grow grapes and we can make a good wine and we need to identify our resources, but where do we get into the economics of the land for the landowners on that north bench?
Well, that's a great question, Craig. That's one of the things we were going to discuss as far as economic viability goes in the next presentation. I mean, we touched on it today, but there was a number of other things to cover, so we couldn't spend too much time on it. But it is by far and away one of the most important facets of this industry. So there's a lot to it. Certainly, even another presentation wouldn't be adequate to cover it, but we certainly can give you plenty of guidance if you want to pursue anything we don't cover to answer some of your questions. And of course, we're always available to answer questions.
Yeah, and another thing too, Craig. Yeah, part of our next presentation is about the economics and infrastructure of a wine industry, and we do delve into the way that land owners are impacted by the passage of an AVA, what it does to their land values, the requirements for water for that land if you were to transform it to viticulture. That's definitely a part of our next presentation, and it's going to be part of the economic section where we discuss total job potential as well as industry and tourism draws to the area. But as Craig mentioned, if you ever have any questions about it, you can feel free to reach out to us and we'll hop on the phone and give you our best thoughts on it.
Okay, yeah, because obviously I'm looking if I'm a landowner and I have 20 acres of land up there and I can either develop it or I can participate in the Wine Alliance, of course, in an overlay. What's the land value and how does that work out? And is there what's the benefit other than I don't know what they pay per acre for in a viticulture type situation or as compared to housing and other things. So that's where I would like to start seeing, make sure not only is it viable from a wine perspective, but is it viable from a financial situation for the landowners as well?
Yep, and that's an important concern that we will be our next presentation, and also I'm sure that is going to be an ongoing topic of conversation during the visioning process as well. So,
if I could just ask another question. Can I ask a question? Okay.
Sure.
And I understand everybody, we need to get a lot of information to make informed decisions. And I'm not trying to say that we don't need to do that. But, I just want you to know from the perspective of myself and the Trails and Open Space Committee, and I represent them from on this committee, the chairperson, I think it kind of is almost misrepresentative when we show aerials or we show maps of the North Bench and going up Oakland Road, because a significant portion of that is the Five Winds Ranch and El Dorado. And so when we're looking at these vast lands going up like that, you have to realize that there are preserved lands and parks over there. There's trails, there's proposed trails. And so, equally important to me and our committee is the continuation of those trails and the beautification and the preservation of those things. And the Five Winds Ranch and the El Dorado have been two of the city's huge projects. So having the vineyards and having all of that tie in is beautiful. But having an understanding of what that's going to look like in 10 or 15 years and what it looked like before is very important to me. So, if we're going to school everybody on that area and what it takes to develop it, I'd like to make sure that, that the presentation of what the Five Winds Ranch and the El Dorado and the trails connecting them throughout Yucaipa, because that's what we've been vigilant in trying to protect all these years. I think that that's very important for all of us to understand. So, perhaps we could take a portion of a meeting so everybody knows that in those areas, there are trails proposed and there are trails existing that will continue to exist regardless of what goes on up there. So I think it could be just a great thing to go through trails and vineyards. I grew up in Sacramento. We used to ride horses through the hop fields. So, I'm telling you that, if we're educating each other on what's going on up there and what needs to go on as part of the Trails and Open Space Committee, I think that I insist that we take time to look at the trail maps and the proposed trail maps, Five Winds Ranch and the El Dorado up there, because that's a vital part of what's going on the North Bench.
Madam
Sure
Chair, may I ask a question? Staff,
Yes.
ask a question. Just in terms of the mechanics or the logistics of moving forward, I agree with what the board This is Ray Casey. I agree with what the board is saying. Time is not of the essence. We may be too late to have an opportunity to apply for a implementation grant this year, regardless, associated with the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program, which was kind of the hope going into this process. So I'm not concerned about the time, but in terms of the process itself, Sheila's been very quiet out there. Several folks have asked her questions and she hasn't had an opportunity to respond. Some of these study elements are also anticipated in their scope. And the way the mechanics would normally work, they would generate a traffic study and staff would review it, or an economic study and staff would review it. Sounds like the board is perhaps interested in the Wine Alliance preparing some of those studies and having staff review those in lieu of our consultant doing some of that work, if I'm not misreading the comments out there. But I just wanted to share that process as how we would normally proceed in an effort to complete a master plan or a specific plan, or as you know, a general plan. And so whatever direction the board wants to go relative to those technical studies, certainly support it. But that's normally the process that we would go through. And some of that's already anticipated in Sheila's scope. Others, like the economic impacts, we've had conversations with them about that precise scope. Happy to work with the Wine Alliance on that as well. But just for clarification, that is, and as you know, Madam Chair, that's the process that is entailed in evaluating those studies, completing and evaluating those studies that are the backbone of a specific plan or a master plan like this.
Ray, this is Denise. I think it's important that we let Sheila do her job, but it would be nice just if the Wine Alliance would share the information they have with her, and she can use that along with all of the information which she has already I assume, put together. So I think this is our consultant's job to do, and I don't want to take that away from her. I just think that she probably could, benefit from any information that the Wine Alliance has in the planning process.
As a real estate broker, I would suggest a neutral third party would handle material like that would be critical to decision making.
Well, that's Sheila.
That's a good approach.
From a planning perspective, that's obviously to me. We've got so many other things to consider. We've got laws, with housing, and all these things that are not in the purview of Wine Alliance. So that's the purpose, is to put this all together. But I want the Wine Alliance information to be readily available to Sheila, and then she can use that along with what she knows to come back to us with the plan, which
Absolutely.
would include.
Well, this is Tony. Or would that just be part of the general? If they have the presentation or the data, they would provide that to her, and she would go about her normal business. That's just another input for her reviews process, right?
Yeah, I think we allow her to Sheila to continue down her path. I think she's put together a good schedule. Her company, we've all looked at it, we've all reviewed it and agreed to it, and allow the Yucaipa Wine Alliance to supplement their information. If it's something we need to see, then we can set it up in the meetings. Otherwise, you can go to Sheila, and Sheila can incorporate it into her presentations.
Absolutely.
This has been with the city, kind of going through that. One of the things we had requested, and I think would be helpful, since as Vice Chair Matlock had identified earlier, is sometimes you get questions after the meeting, and trying to create a repository of some of the data that's been collected so that it's more accessible everyone. And so if the Wine Alliance would be willing to help kind of share that, so that as we get questions from different members, there's sources for some of that data, and then that can be supplemented with the work that Placeworks is doing as well. And then that way, everyone has a chance to revisit portions of the information afterwards. We've been trying to be very diligent about sending out the PowerPoint presentations, maps, and exhibits for those presentations so that everyone has an opportunity to digest that information as well.
Yeah, and yeah, Ben, we're happy to provide, and this is Devin here, we're happy to provide the information that we need to present early to this board. That way everybody can come armed with questions, and we don't ever want to put anyone under the assumption that, you know, the Yucaipa Valley Wine Alliance is trying to take work away from Sheila. Ultimately, this is going to be a big part of her purview working on this project. And we are going to be providing lots of supplementary information to PlaceWorks in addition to what we want to provide to this board, because the dynamics of building a wine industry, we could talk about for 15 hours, let alone 2. And so we're definitely going to be sending Sheila a lot of supplementary information, but I really, especially for two topics that are very important, the mixing of agricultural and residential, the economics of land and the economics of an industry, the very basis of the SALT grant that funds our project. I think these are all pieces of information that, first off, two of those three pieces were requested by Ben and Sheila for us to include in a presentation initially, and we just couldn't get to it in one session. And so these are pieces of information that we do believe need to be presented to this board in an unadulterated and very plainly stated factual manner about what can happen if we go about this, if we strike a good balance here. And so we definitely want to put to a vote us being able to present the second half of our presentation, because we feel it will better inform the city and this board about creating a successful overlay district to serve the entire purpose of this city and the SALT grant.
Hey, Ray, this is Bob Duncan. Can I ask you a question?
Is it on? Certainly.
So did you say that we'd missed an opportunity for grant funding because of something?
Well, the next round of the SALT grant program would have normally been this early fall. Many of the state grants have been pushed back because of the COVID-19 issues, but we were hoping that we would make another round of applications or application for implementation of the vineyard. As you know, we have been working on a change, a potential change or a draft change to the El Dorado Ranch project, and we're on the agenda for open space and trails, or will be on the next agenda for open space and trails, to try to make sure it fits in well with the, you know, the commitments we've made along the way relative to that design. So, but conceptually anyway, the idea is to implement an example vineyard. As Craig mentioned, there are vineyards being implemented throughout the community, of course, but this would be one very visible on Oak Glen Road, and perhaps might be subject to a implementation grant application. And we had envisioned perhaps facilitating private easement implementation grant opportunities as well. And there are some other examples out there. Other communities have done that. And so the idea was to at least get started on the plan, get further along perhaps on the plan, and then use the plan itself for a backbone, if you will, to the application for vineyard implementation, verification in the community. That may not happen this fall, but maybe next fall, depending on the schedule of the board.
I did want to add, though, I have been engaged with the Inland Empire Resources Conservation District, with the local agency formation commission, LAFCO, on their SALT grant application, and plugged us into that. And one of the components is adding essentially a mitigation land banking for ag land that's converted in other jurisdictions, and trying to position potentially the Yucaipa Valley Wine Alliance as a receivership of that mitigation funding. So rather than funding for ag land that's mitigated in other geographical regions, Yucaipa could potentially be maybe one of those receiverships instead and help offset some of the agricultural or viticultural production costs as well. And so that's at least still moving forward, but the construction schedule may be a little bit different.
Ben, what areas are you talking about as far as mitigation land being converted?
So this is part of the entire Inland Empire region. So it's with the San Bernardino agency. So let's say City Redlands has ag land that was set aside under a Williamson Act contract. They're removing it. They have to mitigate the land. And so as part of that mitigation measure, it would create a more streamlined process in theory to keep that in other areas of the Inland Empire versus paying for mitigation land in other, regions. The Central Valley is an example.
But we have quite a bit. We have quite a bit of mitigation land in that North Bench area, don't we?
That's for habitat mitigation. This would be almost different type of mitigation land for other communities that would pay to create vineyards or maintain vineyards in the city of Yucaipa. So that's the in theory goal of that grant, is help to facilitate that component.
Okay. And one other thing that came to my mind when we were talking about minimum parcel sizes that we should think about and requirements, I'd be curious to see a map, and I know we have the zone map, I know we have that, but it would be curious to see a map that specifically shows us 5-acre parcels and then 7 acres and 10-acre parcels, so we know exactly which locations we are talking about, and maybe an approximate number of home sites and lots and parcels that we're talking about, because we're talking apples and oranges. 5 acres versus 10 acres is a whole different ball game, and I'd like to see where those parcels are that could be included, and what the difference is in the density.
We can do that. I did want to clarify quickly the minimum lot sizes. I think when Sheila and I have done the presentations was more in regards to certain type of accessory uses. So if we've received at the city calls for doing, let's say, a wedding venue and vineyard, would you, as a topic of discussion for the board, would certain uses, if you had more intense accessory uses to the wine production facilities, whether or not more minimum or stringent requirements for those facilities would be in place instead of just the grape growing. But if someone wanted to have, let's say, a restaurant associated with a tasting room and their wine production facility, different jurisdictions typically have some sort of scale, and so that's a discussion point that can be considered. There's no set threshold, but certainly worth a discussion whether or not, as part of those permitting processes, that seems prudent.
Yeah, I understand, Ben, and it might be helpful. It might be helpful when we discuss the Five Winds Ranch, because we had those discussions as far as venues and weddings and what was allowable and what wasn't. And it was kind of interesting what the public came up with parameters on what was acceptable: timing, music, lighting, density. So maybe some of the same studies that, Workplace did for the Five Winds Ranch may be viable for the wineries as well. What do you think, Sheila?
Sheila, yep, there you go.
There we go. Okay, thanks. I'm unmuted now. Sure, that makes a lot of sense, Christine. Let's use studies that have already been gathered together. They would certainly be pertinent since they're in the location of the North Bench. That makes a lot of sense. And I'd like to really thank Craig and Devin. What an excellent presentation. It was very, very informative, and I'm very appreciative. I do have a question. You said that the total AVA is 30,000 acres, and 5,000 to 7,000 acres of that is prime ag land. So of that 5,000 to 7,000 acres, how much of that lies within the city limits? Do we know?
Off the top of my head, Sheila, I can't give you an exact amount. I'll tell you what, we do have a couple tools that we can use, and we can actually get back to you with a more accurate count of that acreage. And we'd be happy to include that in our next presentation as well.
Okay, that sounds great. And as far as the schedule goes, that's completely up to the committee. Whatever the committee decides for the next meeting, we're flexible. We are in the middle of, near the end of phase 1 of this effort, and we will be doing more fact finding in phase 2. The goal of phase 1 is really to determine the best direction for the planning tool that will be developed during phase 2. So fact finding will continue to go on through this whole process, and we'll be working a lot with the Wine Alliance through the whole thing.
So Sheila, what was your plans for the next meeting?
We had scheduled the visioning meeting for the next time, where everyone can use their imagination and just think about what their vision is for the future of Yucaipa.
Okay. If we can get the next presentation of the Wine Alliance in somehow, or have a study session that is not included in one of these meetings, to who would like to attend, before the next meeting, maybe that would be the way to handle this. I don't know. How does the rest of the committee feel about having a study session?
Jillian Kowalczyk here. I'm really interested in hearing about the mixing of the residential and the agriculture. And I'm very interested in finding out if there's going to be septic or sewage and how that's going to affect it as well. And I'd also like to hear about the trails and open spaces. I think the more information we have in this group, the better, because as we're making these decisions, I'd rather make the proper decisions for all of the city rather than having to go back and fix something later. So time to me isn't so important, rather than doing it properly.
Yeah, I would agree with Jillian. I really don't think time is of the, and again, we need to really consider all the information in order to make an informed decision. So,
Well, we can certainly meet again, right? We don't have to wait a whole month. Maybe Devin and Craig put a lot of time and energy into it, and perhaps we can meet next week for an hour.
I'll be the first one to say, I do. That'd be great, Christine, if we can meet next week. Craig and I have pretty full schedules with bottling as well as running the winery, and it took a really long time to put this presentation together. And if we do want to set another meeting, outside of this committee, I guess we could do that. But
no, I think it should be with the committee.
Exactly, and that's why we were suggesting
with the committee. Yeah, just pick a time and let us know.
And that's kind of just why we were suggesting everyone here, because everyone here has kind of made the statement that time is not of the essence here, and getting it right really is the most important thing. We would really just like to present the second half of this at the next meeting of this committee in June, and we can send it. It'll take us a while to get this presentation done, but we can send the presentation to the committee at least a week prior. And that way everyone can come with questions, and that way, instead of having to digest all the information in real time, everyone can digest it beforehand, and we can have a more meaningful discussion in person, or at least over Microsoft Teams.
Okay, we may need to just schedule a longer meeting the next time. Sheila, how does that work with the visioning? Can we do it all at one meeting?
Sheila, don't forget we're muted.
Devin, how long will it take you guys to get your next report ready? Will it take the full month, or?
I'd say it would take at least 2.5 weeks for us to do, just because of our schedules coming up are pretty busy. So
I'm just wondering if we don't cancel a meeting or take out a meeting, but just stagger the meetings and throw an extra one in somewhere, whether we do yours and then the June meeting and move back a week or so, but we stay on task and we get your stuff. I think you sending the information is going to help, because a lot of what we learned today, we were able to read. And I think that'll help a lot to cut out a lot of time as well.
Sure. And, scheduling is always difficult when we're dealing with a board of this size. And I do think it was brought up maybe lengthening the next meeting to include the rest of the presentation and a visioning session might be a good solution. I think Craig and I would definitely be for that.
That's what I'm suggesting, but I need to know what Sheila thinks.
Personally, I don't think that will work because the visioning needs to be, honestly, the visioning would work best if we could all meet in person. So it may work better to have the next meeting be the Wine Alliance second half and then have visioning afterwards, because hopefully by that time we'll be able to all meet in person again.
This has been here, just to clarify. So right now, our last two meetings have actually been kind of a week behind of the normal schedule. So the next actual regular date schedule would be June 9th. Whether or not we can maybe do that presentation, maintain that date, and then try to do the visioning from there. Sheila and I both thought we do think that the in-person helps because you can be a lot more creative, it's much more facilitative, and then some visions of having it at a remote or special location, kind of to help everyone draw inspiration as well at the Five Winds Ranch. And so that would, I think, make a really great backdrop as we get into those discussions. And so right now we're kind of in holding pattern as we wait more guidance from the state on that kind of in-person meeting, but hopefully soon.
Is it, well, this is Tony. Would the 9th then be a good, would Craig and Evan be able to get their presentation for the 9th out?
I think that's totally reasonable, Tony.
And then I do like the concept of having the visioning session with us in person, whether it's outside and we're, 6.5 feet apart, but at least we're able to get together and look at each other and talk about this.
Yeah, the visioning is much better held in person. You're going to be throwing out ideas. We're going to be writing them down. We're going to have pictures all over the walls. You're going to be putting stickers on pictures that you like. And it's really very difficult to do in this type of format. So
I remember you
that's my
talking
recommendation.
about, very much like we did with the kind of the sessions with the general plan so that does need to be in person, I think. So the likelihood would be July before we could do that now. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And I have a question for Ray. You mentioned the getting the petition or for the funding. Can that be done without us having to have another meeting, or is it so tied up with what we're talking about?
It may be that we can do it based on where we're at in the process. As Ben mentioned, they're kind of going on a parallel path, Inland Empire Resource Conservation District, so that may accomplish even more than what we were anticipating doing as staff. But we'll communicate with Ben and Inland Empire Resource Conservation District, and we'll see whether we should go forward with a city application like we did with the planning effort, or whether we should just continue to partner with IRCD.
Okay.
All right, then.
This has been here. The one thing I wanted to add, kind of as we approach the visioning, is kind of everyone's stance of getting photos of inspiration and sending it to Sheila, so that way we can include that as part of the fun activity we would like to do. So.
Okay. I don't get a motion or a second anything to change the next meeting for the presentation. I think you can just schedule that, right, Ben?
Yeah, it seems like there's pretty wide support for that. So I request that the Wine Alliance and I and Sheila communicate, and we can get that set up and move forward with that.
For June
for June 9th. Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Does anyone else have anything to add or questions or comments?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
It's a little off topic, but I was happened to be at city council meeting on a week ago Monday. And if you guys weren't there, oh my gosh, that was a stressful city council that was regarding budget cuts and deficits and money and all kinds of things. So, I have to tell you, if you have an opportunity to go back and listen to it, I have to tell you our city council is beautiful, and I can't imagine what they have gone through over the last month. Ray Casey and his staff, oh my gosh, Ray, I felt so sorry for you. I thought you were going to have a nervous breakdown. But the way our city is run and the way that our city is handled, and you probably don't know that, we had a 30% surplus, which helped us, tighten our belts and overcome this emergency situation, which we are seeing 15%, reduction in sales taxes. And, they were wringing their hands over closing a fire station or reducing it down to a paramedics, and special projects are off, and part-timers are off. And so, when the city is going into things that are tightening their belts, it's good to have people who are vigilant about their money. So I just have to tip my hat to city staff, and the way that it handled. City council was beautiful as well. And for those of you that weren't there, because there was only 3 of us from the general public, you should go back and listen to that part of the meeting. It tells you who's at the helm, and I appreciate that very much. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Christine. Anyone else? Yeah, we all know Ray's always has a tough job, but it's probably a little bit tougher right now. So we appreciate it very much. Any other announcements then? Nope. Okay. I guess we'll stand in adjournment till June 9th.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay. All right, everyone. Stay healthy.